Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 44 and this week we are going to make our penultimate block for the central panel on our garden quilt. So if you're not sure what we're doing, we're making a quilt on a garden theme. We started this back in January and we've made roughly one block a week, sometimes a couple more, sometimes a block has taken 2 weeks. And if you want to go back to the beginning or you want to see any of the other videos in this series, I will put the playlist at the top of the screen so that you can go and watch anything you've missed. Our blocks tend to work quite well as standalone pieces as well, so if you don't fancy making a quilt, there are loads and loads of projects for you to have a go at that would make quite a nice piece of textile art. So let's start by going around what's on our table. I'm starting this week with my backing fabric, and I've got a piece of my ladybird pattern fabric and I've cut this to 20 by 20 centimeters square. I've also got some plain white fabric. We're going to applique something on here, and because the background is quite busy I wanted this to be very plain, so I've just got a piece of plain white linen, this vintage linen, but any white cotton will work. And I've also got my heat and seal. Now this is just like Bondweb. If you prefer Bondweb or Bondweb is what you have, then just go for it. I've been using heat and seal recently. I saw it in Hobbycraft in the UK and thought I'd give it a try, and you get a much bigger piece for your money than you get with Bondweb. And I think the initial bond is a little bit stronger than with Bondweb, but the glue is much thicker, so it is a little bit harder to stitch through. How it will hold up to washing and over time remains to be seen, but I'm quite enjoying using this at the moment. So I've got my embroidery scissors and my paper scissors because we've got to cut through the paper layer on our heat and seal. I've got some marking tools, so I've got my pencil, my aqua pen because we're going to be using an iron, and my heat erase pen. And then I've got my threads. Now these are all Anchor brand, it's my brand of choice, and I'm using colours from my colour scheme. So I've got my red, which is 046, my yellow, which is 298, my light green, which is 255, my mid green, which is 258, my very dark green, which is 683, my blue, which is 130, my pink, which is 025, and my white, which is 001. I might bring in a couple of other colours, but if I do I'll let you know as we're going along. So there is a template for this week. This is our penultimate template as well. This is available on our website. I'll put the address at the bottom of the screen there. It costs £1 to download. It's just a nominal charge to help cover the cost of making these videos and to keep our channel running. If you feel happy sketching your own version, then please don't feel obliged, but I know there are some of you that prefer something more structured to follow. So as you can see, this week we're going to make a garden gate, and we're going to stitch some florals around the side, and we're going to put a little welcome sign on the gate. Now I've put welcome. If you want to put your name, you can. If you want to put a significant number, you can. I know when I made my seaside quilt with Sew and Stitch magazine, I put my age at the time that I was making it on one of the sails on the boat, or you could put the year that you've made it. You can replace this with whatever you like, but I think I'm going to put welcome. So this is all sized up for you, and you'll see there are two squares. This is the outer edge of the block, and the inner square is our seam allowance, so that's why there are two squares. So I'm going to start by transferring my pattern onto my fabric. So I hope you can see here I've just used my aqua pen because we're going to be appliquing on top of this. I've just used my aqua pen to put in the markers that I'm going to be using. So I've marked in the grass line here, and I've marked in the details of the gate. Now a lot of this will be covered up. So I'm also going to transfer the design onto the fabric that I'm going to make the gate out of. Now I'm bringing in my light box, and as I say every time, you don't need a light box, you can just hold this up to a window. I did that for absolutely years before I got hold of a light box. I'm going to bond web this, but there are actually a number of ways that you could make this gate. You could actually do this as some English paper piecing if you wanted to. You could cut some strips out of paper and you could English paper piece each part and then stitch it together. I will link a video at the top of the screen that explains the English paper piecing process. We used it when we did our bee, and we used it when we made our ladybird as well. So you could do that, or you could do it in the way that I'm going to do it, which is just quite simple bond web. So let's just start with the post at the side. I'm actually bringing a ruler in because I want this to be fairly precise, and I'm just going to trace over that line that's showing through, and I've got my little post there. These can be quite close together because it's all going to be cut out of the same fabric, but I'm going to move it a little bit just to make it easier to cut round. I'm marking in all the lines in between the planks of the gate, and I'm also going to mark in that little oval for my welcome sign. Just putting in the outside lines there, and then move it along a little bit and put in my second gate post. So I've deliberately not put in the word welcome because I'm going to handwrite that, and I want a finer pen than this one. So once it's all attached to the fabric, I can bring in my heat erase pen. So I'm going to put my design face down on my ironing mat, and I just want a piece of heat and seal that covers the whole of the back of that shape. And I'm going to put one large piece of heat and seal right across the back of the design, so I don't need to trace onto my heat and seal this time because we're just going to do this all in one piece. Now we're going to fuse this to the back of the fabric, so I want my heat and seal glue side down onto the fabric, and with heat and seal we smooth the iron across to push out any air pockets, and we only need to hold it down for about 2 or 3 seconds in each spot. So once that's cooled, I'm going to cut out the 3 pieces of the gate, so the 2 posts and that central section. And you can see me rotating the fabric there, not the scissors. And then I can peel off the backing paper and make sure I'm putting these on glue side down. I can't tell you how many times I've attached plain fabric with the glue side up and fused it to my iron, not the backing fabric, so please learn from my mistakes. And this time we hold our iron down for about 10 seconds to make sure that bond is really secure. So once I've done that fence post, I'm putting on my central gate piece, and then the final gate post. And you can see there I've sketched in my lettering, and now it's time to get stitching. So I've threaded up my needle with one strand of blue thread and one strand of white. I ummed and ahed about how to stitch this for ages, and I wanted it to be strong enough that you could see the stitching, but not so strong that it took over. So I thought blended thread would work really well. I'm going to do a whipped back stitch up each of these lines, and I'm going to start by bringing my needle through one stitch length up from the bottom of the gate. Then I'm going to take my needle down at the bottom of the gate, so working towards myself, and I'm going to rock my needle forward so that it comes up one stitch length beyond where that working thread initially comes out, and that leaves a little gap. Then I'm going to take my needle back down across the gap at the end of that first stitch and rock my needle forward again so that it's a stitch length beyond where the thread comes out, and then I'm going to work back to the end of that previous stitch, rock my needle forward one stitch length again and pull through, and then go back to the end of the previous stitch and rock forward, and that's basically back stitch. So I'm going to work my way up each of the lines of the planks on that gate, so there'll be a double line of stitching in between each plank. And if your stitches go a little bit wobbly, it's not the end of the world, because we're going to whip our back stitch, and the whipping process tends to even everything out. So I've brought my needle up right at the top of the gate there, and I'm going to just slide my needle underneath each stitch on my way down. Now it's really important that you don't go through the fabric and that you don't catch any of your stitches. You want to just make sure your needle is sliding right underneath each stitch, and you always want to work in the same direction as well. So you can see me working from right to left on each stitch, and that gives a lovely raised textured line to your stitch. I just caught my loop there, so I'm just going back through, and evens up all your back stitches as well. It gives a really lovely solid line. So then I'm taking my thread back through to the back, and then I can come up again at the beginning of the next line along and work that line of stitching in exactly the same way. So here we are, I've put in all my lines and I've worked around the outside of each shape and those little circles at the top, and I have to be honest, that took way longer than I thought it was going to. So this might be one to just sit and do in front of the TV or listening to an audio book or something like that, so that you can stay awake and get all that stitching done. So I'm just going to put my lettering in now, and I've got two strands of my darkest green thread, and I'm going to use the same stitch again, but this time I need to make sure my stitches are fairly precise and very small. So you need to kind of work smaller stitches than instinct tells you to, and it's really important for getting a really good finish on your lettering. If your stitches are too big, you'll end up with really angular lettering, and you'll have points in places that they don't belong. And also when you whip your back stitch, you'll end up with the whipping sort of detaching itself a little bit from the actual stitches, particularly when you're working around curves, so you end up creating little tiny triangles all over your lettering. And so to prevent that, you want to keep your stitches really tiny. So my stitches here on this downstroke of the W are about 3mm long. I've got 3 stitches in there, and then as I'm working back up in the centre of the W, I'm going to get 2 stitches in, and then I'll do 2 stitches back down and 3 stitches back up again. And it's really worth taking your time to make sure your needle is going exactly where you want your stitches to go. So don't just go for it and hope for the best. It's worth just taking the time to reposition your needle if you need to. So I thought I'd just show you how I work my curved letter. So I'm starting in the centre of that E, and hopefully you can see that I'm making my stitches really small here to get that curve to work. I've made 2 stitches just to get me across the width of the letter, and then as I go round that curve around the side there, I've actually made an almost vertical stitch up the side of that E, and then I'm putting a diagonal stitch up to the top of the E, and then working an almost horizontal stitch across the top. And it's really important that you don't try and make the leaps between each point of the letter too big. So you can see I've got an almost vertical stitch there and a horizontal across the top. If you try and make it in one go, you'll end up with almost a diamond shaped letter, and so at the point where your curves are at their sharpest, you need to add tiny little stitches that are going to force the curve rather than cause it to go really angular. So the other thing you need to bear in mind is the whipping process of a curved letter. Because you're going to rotate your shape as you work your way around the circle, it's really easy to lose track of which direction you're working in. So rather than thinking about it from left to right, I imagine the letter as a sort of circle or oval, and I work from inside the circle to outside, and that way as I turn my work I don't get confused about which is left and which is right. I've just got to remember that I'm going from the inside of the circle to the outside, and it makes sure that your whipping stitches go in the same direction all the way around and keep your letter a nice even shape. I also think that if you work from inside to outside, it kind of pulls the curves in the right direction as well. So if you worked them outside to inside, you're kind of pulling your stitches in rather than pushing them out. So for me, I find it works better, but experiment and see what works for you. So once I've whipped all the way around my letter, I can take my needle back down through the fabric to the back, and I can either finish off my thread then on the back, or I can hop across to my next letter and whip that as well. So you can see how lovely and strong those lines are. I'm going to put in the rest of the letters and then just iron away the pen marks so that you can see it more clearly. Okay, so I've finished my lettering there and I've ironed away the pen, and so you can see it's a nice sharp line now. And I also thought it was looking a bit wishy-washy, so I've just put in some red running stitch just around the inside of that back stitch outline of the oval, and I just think it brings some of the red from the backing fabric onto the gate and just brightens it up a little bit. So now we're going to work on our florals, and I'm going to start by putting in a bit of foliage. So I've got two strands of my mid green here, and I thought I would just put in a stem first of all, and I'm going to work this in stem stitch. So I'm going to come up at the end of the line, work a full stitch length forward, and then rock my needle back to halfway between where the thread comes out and where I've just taken my needle back in. When I pull through, I end up with this little T shape, and I want my thread to work over the top of my stitch, so I'm going to just lift it above. I'm going to go one stitch length further on again and rock back to the end of that first stitch and pull through. Then I'm going to do exactly the same again, so thread over the top, work forward a stitch length, rock the needle back to halfway along and pull through. And this makes a lovely line that almost looks twisted. It's great for working around curves, and for making solid lines. It's a lovely textured line. I do love a stem stitch. So I'm working my way along there. Then I'm just going to put some leaves in along this stem, and we're going to make these in our usual way. So I'm going to bring my needle up at the top of the stem, and I'm going to make a little detached chain stitch. So just trying to get my needle through there. I'm going to loop my thread around and go back down in the same place that my thread came up, rock forward and catch that loop in place, then put a little anchor stitch over the end, bring my needle back up inside that little chain stitch that I've made and put a straight stitch down the middle just to fill it out a bit. And if you're not sure, any of my florals videos in this playlist will show you how to do this in more detail. So I'm just looping my thread around, rocking my needle forward to catch the loop, putting in my little anchor stitch and rocking back to just inside that loop, and then putting a straight stitch down the middle. And I'm just going to work those down the stem, working left and right, and I'm quite happy if these overlap the gate a little bit. So you can really play around with this one and experiment with your stitches and just play really with the stitches that you know. So now I've got 2 strands of my lightest green, and I'm going to make a little stem out of feather stitch now, and I'm going to make these feather stitches quite deep so that they overlap each other. So this is very similar to a chain stitch, but rather than closing up my loops, I'm going to keep them open. So now I'm putting in another little stem, very much like that first one that I put in. I'm using my darkest green, and I want that foliage to just look quite organic, head off in different directions and overlap the gate a little bit as well, so that it just looks like these plants are growing. So now I'm going to put some flowers in, and I've got my biggest circles, and I'm adding a little circular centre to 3 of the biggest circles there. So I'm making a sort of polo mint lifesaver if you're watching in America. And I'm going to use a woven wheel for this. We're not going to weave, we're just going to use some anchor stitches to hold some wrapped threads in place. So all I'm doing here is putting some straight stitches that go between the outside circle and the inner circle. So there will be a void in the centre of this flower for the time being. I just want to put some stitches in that sort of radiate out like hands on a clock, I suppose, or spokes on a wheel. So now, in an unusual move for me, I'm using all 6 strands of a piece of yellow thread, and I've brought my thread up on the edge of that centre circle, and I'm just sliding my needle underneath each of those little spokes that I've put in, turning my work, and I'm not weaving going over under because I don't want too much height on this flower, because this quilt is going to be used, so we want a really secure stitch. And I find that with woven wheels sometimes your stitches can get very loopy and end up being quite vulnerable. They can be caught on things and pull out of shape. So I'm just sliding my needle underneath and just working my way round and round the circle until all of the space under those stitches is full. And you want to try and make your threads sit next to each other as you work round rather than bunching up, partly so that the space fills up quickly, but also so that you don't create loops and raised areas that are going to catch on things. So I'm just using my needle there to pull those stitches out a little bit in between those spokes, and when the space is full I'm just going to take my needle back down to the back of the fabric so that I can secure it. And in that void at the centre I'm just going to put in some French knots. So I've got 2 strands of my darkest green here, and to make a French knot I'm going to bring my thread through the fabric. I'm going to hold that thread taut towards myself and rest the needle on the thread, and then I'm going to wrap the thread over the needle a few times and then take my needle back down through the fabric to pull that through into a knot. If you're not sure about any of the stitches I'm using, I do have a full playlist of stitch tutorial videos. I will link it at the top of the screen. Everything I use is in there, so you can go and have a browse and see if you can learn some new stitches to add to your repertoire. So once I've put my 3 main flowers in, it's then just a matter of filling in the space with whatever kinds of flower you feel like creating. I'm just putting in a lazy daisy here with lots and lots of petals. I want to make sure that all the space is covered, so all of that backing fabric is covered over in this floral section. So I want to make these flowers quite dense, and I've made my little lazy daisy here, and I'm just going to fill in the spaces between with similar stitches. So I used 2 strands of blue there. I think I've got 2 strands of pink here, and I'm going to put in another little lazy daisy. And this is really just a matter of playing and creating flower shapes out of the stitches that you know. So you could use French knots, you could use pistol stitches, lazy daisies, you could use wheat ear stitch, you could even go really bananas and do some bullion knot flowers. There are loads and loads of variations that you can do, and do look through some of our other florals videos in this series so that you can get some ideas if you need to. There's loads of possibilities. I will come back and put little French knots at the centre of these flowers so that they look a bit more finished. So if you're not sure, a lazy daisy is just lots of detached chain stitches all starting at a central point and radiating out in a circle. So another favourite of mine is to use star stitch as a filler, and this is really easy. It's just 2 cross stitches, so I've made a diagonal stitch there, come up and made a diagonal in the opposite direction, and then I do a vertical and horizontal stitch across that so that they all cross over at the centre. And then if your stitch is a little bit wobbly, you can put a little tiny anchor stitch by coming up right at the centre and making a stitch over that crossing point, and that just pulls your stitches in at the centre and makes them look really even. And you can scatter these around, they look really nice. So you can see how that's filling out, and you get the idea what I'm doing. I'm going to fill out that section and then work on the right hand side as well. So here's our almost finished piece. I have to confess I ran out of my dark green thread, and it's not going to be, I've ordered some more, but it's not going to be here in time to finish this video. So that's our finished piece. I think this one's really cute. I really like the little gate, and I think the welcome sign is really nice. My favourite bit is actually this whipped back stitch separating the planks. I love the fact that it kind of creates its own shadow and has got a little bit of raised texture. And if I bring up florals up close. Hopefully you can see the detail of the flowers there. I've added a little bit of grass around the bottom of the gate and some extra leaves in amongst the flowers. I think in hindsight I could have used a plain fabric, but I quite like that it's a bit different to the other ones that I've stitched, so I quite like the fact that we've got some ladybirds, and it does give the suggestion of a busy garden behind that gate. So that's our penultimate block. I hope you've enjoyed that. I can't wait to see your versions of this. Do share them at hashtag FSH23quilt, and yeah, I can't wait to see what you come up with. If you have enjoyed this, please do give us a like. We really appreciate it. It helps other people find our videos as well. If you want some similar projects to this, I've got a couple that are floral embroideries in this series, and I'll link some videos over here. If you want more of our content, just click on our logo down here in the corner of the screen. It makes it really easy for you to subscribe. We'd love to have you as part of our little Feather Stitch House family. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great week making your garden gate block, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!